the 15th of June 2021. A search dog follows a 5-year-old scent down a hillside, across a yard, onto a gravel driveway. Then it stops. The handler radios in. The dog circles, agitated. The scent is gone, not faded, gone. And everyone standing there knows what that means. She didn't wander into the woods, she got into a vehicle. 4.5 years later, federal agents would descend on a pig farm 9 miles away, tied to a family who lived on that same road. But by then, the trail had gone cold. Or had it? Before we go any further, I need to know something. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I want to see how far this story is traveling. Beech Creek, Tennessee. Population barely 1,000. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets don't stay buried for long, and where a missing child should have been found within hours. Should have been, but Summer Wells wasn't. On the 15th of June 2021, the 5-year-old vanished from her family's property on Ben Hill Road. One moment she was there, the next, gone. The initial response was textbook. Search teams fanned out across the holler. Volunteers combed the woods. Helicopters circled overhead. Thermal imaging swept the terrain. The creek beds were searched. The ravines were checked. And then, slowly, the updates stopped. Not slowed down, stopped. The press conferences dried up. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation went silent. The Hawkins County Sheriff's Office offered nothing. No meaningful updates. No disclosures about leads. No confirmation of any specific search targets. For 4.5 years, the case became a black hole. Information went in. Nothing came out. This wasn't the usual investigative caution. This was a pattern so rigid that even routine clarifications became rare. When families asked questions, they were told the investigation was ongoing. When reporters pressed for details, they were met with the same scripted responses, following leads, reviewing all possibilities, continuing to investigate. Safe language, vague language, language that risked nothing and revealed even less. The silence wasn't just frustrating, it was suffocating. And in that vacuum, speculation grew. Online communities dissected every detail. Theories multiplied. Accusations flew. The case became a battleground of narratives, none of them confirmed, none of them denied. But here's the thing about silence. It doesn't protect the truth. It protects something else. And in this case, what it was protecting was about to crack wide open. Because secrecy doesn't simply dissolve. It fractures only when something forces it to break. And in late 2023, something did. Without warning, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation announced a coordinated operation. Not a press conference about progress, not a symbolic gesture, an actual operation, a raid. And for the first time in 4.5 years, they named a location, 3,500 Van Hill Road, a 27-acre pig farm, the first publicly identified physical location associated with an active evidentiary lead. Let that sink in. 4.5 years of silence, 4.5 years of no named search locations, and then, suddenly, federal agents descend on a rural pig farm nearly 10 miles from the Wells home. The significance of that shift cannot be overstated. For years, residents of Beech Creek heard generic references to following leads. None of those phrases risked implying material evidence. None suggested forward momentum. This statement did. Authorities confirmed that the operation was triggered by what the FBI described as a credible tip of evidentiary value. That phrasing is unusually direct for a case where public statements are typically pared down to the safest possible language. It acknowledged that something tangible, physical, testimonial, or forensic had pointed federal agents to a specific rural property. And it wasn't the TBI that initiated the movement. It was the FBI. Federal involvement in a local missing child case is rare. It happens when an interstate element is suspected, when a specific evidence-based threat is identified, or when a forensic anomaly emerges that requires federal testing resources. So, what did the FBI know that local law enforcement didn't? Or more accurately, what did they finally have enough of to act on? To understand why this announcement was so destabilizing, you have to understand the silence that came before it. The last official update prior to the raid was the release of an age progression image in August of the previous year. A symbolic gesture, not a breakthrough. Nothing about evidence, nothing about suspects, nothing about search locations. Just a digitally aged photo of a little girl who might look different now. That was it. For years, the justification for the blackout was always the same. The investigation is so hot, so live, that any disclosure could compromise it. Secrecy, they said, was a form of protection. But if that were true, why did the secrecy suddenly shatter? What was strong enough to force it? The scale of the operation provides partial context. Locals reported seeing up to 15 Hawkins County Sheriff's Office vehicles. The TBI was present. The FBI was present. Specialized units were present. This was not a cursory sweep of a rural property. It was a saturation search, executed after years of investigative inertia and concealed from the public until the operation had fully concluded. A tactical decision, a good move, some said, to prevent absolute carnage from onlookers, because if word had gotten out before the raid, the property would have been swarmed. Citizen investigators, YouTubers, reporters, the kind of chaos that destroys evidence and compromises investigations. Whatever brought them there was significant enough to mobilize federal resources while simultaneously requiring absolute discretion on the ground. But here's where the story takes a turn. Here's where the pieces start to align in a way that's impossible to ignore. The property on 3500 Van Hill Road isn't just another rural parcel in Hawkins County. It's a 27-acre pig farm with multiple structures, an unusually short and secluded driveway, and a lineage of occupants whose connections to the Summer Wells case form one of the tightest relational clusters identified in 4.5 years. The land belongs to Paul Hill, an elderly man, but the record outlines a network of connections between Paul Hill, his adult sons, and Fred Hill, a nephew who lived on Ben Hill Road at the time of Summer's disappearance. These aren't distant or hypothetical relationships, they are blood ties. Fred Hill, in particular, is a figure who has hovered around the narrative since the earliest days. Not always as a suspect, but consistently as someone geographically and socially positioned near the point of disappearance. He lived on Ben Hill Road, the same road where Summer Wells lived, the same road where she was last seen. His relocation out of Tennessee does not erase his proximity to the original scene, nor his relevance within the local interpersonal network. And now, 4.5 years later, federal agents descend on a property owned by his uncle, a property 9.5 miles from the Wells home, a property with a large barn, lots of vehicles, debris fields, and acreage that goes all the way back into the mountain. So the question becomes unavoidable. Why does the first publicly acknowledged FBI operation occur at a property connected by blood to a man who has been in the narrative since day one? The file does not answer this question directly, but it provides the components necessary to interrogate it. For one, the FBI, not local law enforcement, initiated the lead. This is noteworthy because the FBI rarely takes primary action in a missing child case, unless an interstate element is suspected, a specific evidence-based threat is identified, or a forensic anomaly emerges that requires federal testing resources. Second, the search was not symbolic. It was evidence-driven. The sheriff's office sat up and took notice. The TBI was all over it. And the FBI acted only after a long investigation into a particular line of inquiry. These phrases imply persistence, scrutiny, and verification. Not rumor, not speculation, verification. Someone told them something. Someone gave them something. And whatever it was strong enough to break 4.5 years of silence. Third, the report stresses the possibility that evidence found on the property may not necessarily indicate that Summer's remains are present. Instead, it may indicate that she was there, even briefly, even historically. That distinction matters, because in forensic investigations, presence is enough. You don't need a body to prove a child was at a location. You need trace evidence, DNA, soil disturbances, object transfer, chemical residues. Any of these can confirm that a child was moved from one location to another, and that's exactly what happened in the Michael Vaughn case. Remains were never found, but evidence confirmed presence. Suspects were named. Arrests were made. The absence of a body did not prevent justice. Finally, the pig farm itself introduces a forensic complication. Biological material can degrade rapidly in environments involving animal scavenging, organic waste, and continuous soil disturbance. This is not speculation. It is a forensic reality. The report notes the difficulty investigators face in trying to recover evidence nearly 4.5 years later and references DNA testing, soil samples, and very difficult, complex investigation. A pig farm is, in effect, one of the most challenging locations for long-term forensic recovery. And yet, despite all these obstacles, the FBI acted, meaning the potential evidence was deemed strong enough to justify the search, the manpower, the secrecy, and the disruption. When these elements converge, federal initiation, familial linkage, site complexity, and investigative scale, the silence of the past 4 years becomes less a sign of stagnation and more a sign of direction, a direction that has now surfaced publicly for the first time. But before we can understand why federal agents broke a 4-year blackout and pulled onto a property tied to a family embedded in the earliest hours of this case, we need to go back to the property itself, back to the people connected to it, back to the physical landscape that makes this location so forensically significant. The property on 3,500 Van Hill Road is not just another rural parcel. It is a 27-acre pig farm with multiple structures, an unusually short and secluded driveway, and a lineage of occupants whose connections to the Summer Wells case form one of the tightest relational clusters identified in 4.5 years. When federal agents descend on any property, the event demands scrutiny. When they descend on this property, owned by a man whose relatives were present on Ben Hill Road the day Summer vanished, the scrutiny becomes unavoidable. And when those same agents label the tip that brought them there as one of credible evidentiary value, the investigative lens must sharpen beyond the level of coincidence. Before examining the relational web, the physical landscape itself must be dissected. The file describes the farm as containing some kind of barn, like a big barn, a primary house, lots of vehicles, debris, and acreage that goes all the way back into the mountain. The significance of this layout is forensic rather than cosmetic. A barn provides enclosed space with decades of accumulated material, wood, metal, soil, animal bedding, each of which can retain biological trace evidence. The debris fields create potential deposition sites where objects, clothing, or biological matter could be concealed under layers of refuse. The mountainous rear acreage offers both canopy cover and geological concealment, environments where scent dissipation and animal activity complicate detection. This is not a simple residential yard. It is a multi-zone environment with several evidence retention and evidence destruction vectors. And here's what makes it even more significant: the property's short driveway. The file calls attention to it, noting that media presence during an active search would have caused absolute carnage because of the limited space and visibility. A short driveway minimizes sightlines. Anyone entering or exiting can do so with minimal public exposure. Vehicles can appear and disappear with far greater ease than on properties with long, open approach paths. This feature alone does not imply wrongdoing, but paired with the land's other characteristics, it underscores how an offender, if one existed, could exploit the geography. You could drive in, do what you needed to do, and drive out without anyone seeing you, without anyone knowing you were ever there. The presence of many vehicles on site, as recorded in the drone images referenced in the file, also carries forensic weight. Vehicles are transient, porous evidence environments. They retain soil, fibers, biological cells, and chemical traces long after a single event. A cluster of old or unused vehicles increases the number of potential evidence reservoirs investigators must consider. When such a cluster exists on land tied to relevant individuals, it becomes more than background noise. It becomes a forensic priority. This brings us to the most striking element of all: the people connected to this property. The land belongs to Paul Hill, an elderly man. But the available record emphasizes that Paul Hill's relatives, notably 2 adult sons and a nephew, Fred Hill, are part of the investigative perimeter. Fred lived on Ben Hill Road when Summer disappeared. His proximity to the Wells home on the 15th of June 2021 is a matter of record, not speculation. He has since moved out of Tennessee, but the location of an individual today has no bearing on their relevance to past events. What matters is presence, proximity, and access on the critical date, and Fred Hill had all three. The presence of the red truck in the narrative tightens this cluster into a closed loop. According to the file, a red truck was seen on Ben Hill Road at the time Summer vanished. The source further states that a nephew of Paul Hill lived on Ben Hill Road at the time of Summer's disappearance, and that speculation has long surrounded the relationship between Paul Hill's family and individuals connected to that vehicle. Though the material does not confirm ownership, the overlapping names, locations, and observed vehicles form a relational vector impossible to ignore. With these three elements, land owned by Paul Hill, Fred Hill's presence on Ben Hill Road, and the red truck spotted that day, the property becomes more than a geography. It becomes a family-anchored axis of relevance. The shock of this part of the investigation is not the pig farm itself. It is the alignment of people, vehicles, and locations into one linear connection. This alignment dramatically reframes the meaning of the raid. The search was not random. Federal agencies do not commit manpower, equipment, and tactical secrecy to a site without a vetted evidentiary basis. The source spells this out. The FBI received a lead that was credible and of evidentiary value, language far stronger than the vague statements historically offered by TBI. The scale of law enforcement presence confirms this. Locals saw up to 15 Hawkins County Sheriff's Office cars, as well as FBI and TBI units. Multi-agency operations of this magnitude are rare in rural missing child cases unless one of two conditions is met. A forensic indicator strongly suggests the child was on that property, or a testimonial source with verifiable access provides information consistent with other evidence. The agency involvement here echoes patterns seen in cases like Michael Vaughan, where federal interest surged only once. Hard evidence indicated the child had been present at a secondary location, even though his remains were never recovered. The file draws that comparison explicitly. Thus, the raid on 3500 Van Hill Road cannot be dismissed as routine. It represents a threshold, one reached only when multiple streams of evidence converge. And convergence is exactly what this property represents: physical, geographic, relational, and historical intersection. The unusual secrecy surrounding the operation further supports this interpretation. According to the file, the raid was fully completed before authorities disclosed it to the media, a rare departure from standard search and rescue transparency. This indicates a desire to protect the integrity of evidence before public attention contaminated the environment. If investigators feared individuals connected to the property might remove, alter, or destroy material, then surprise was essential. They couldn't risk a tip-off. They couldn't risk someone cleaning up before they got there. But what kind of evidence could still exist after 4 years? The record acknowledges the challenge. Pig farms are difficult environments for forensic recovery, especially soil-based evidence. DNA can degrade. Odor profiles can be disrupted. Organic processes can obscure deposition sites. And yet, despite all these obstacles, the FBI acted, meaning the potential evidence was deemed strong enough to justify the search, the manpower, the secrecy, and the disruption. This raises the central investigative question that underpins the entire narrative of this part. If this land had no relevance, why did federal agents arrive after 4 years of refusing to reveal any search location? The timeline compounds the urgency of that question. For the first 4.5 years, law enforcement avoided naming any search location. So, why name this one? Why now? The file emphasizes that the sheriff's office sat up and took notice, and that the TBI was all over it, implying a level of internal alarm or momentum absent in prior years. When evaluated collectively, the elements form a logical, investigative structure, a property with secluded geography, multiple structures, and evidence retention potential. A familial network tied to the immediate vicinity of the disappearance. A vehicle of interest associated with that same network. A federal lead with confirmed evidentiary weight. A multi-agency search executed only after careful timing and strategy. Nothing in this alignment suggests coincidence. Everything in it suggests relevance. And until law enforcement reveals their findings, if they ever do, the question remains open, suspended between silence, geography, and bloodlines. But there's another fracture in this case, one that doesn't come from the scent trail, the red truck, or the inconsistencies in parental statements. It stems from a detail that was buried for years, a detail that, when brought to light, collapses the entire timeline. In any missing child investigation, the timeline is the backbone of the case. When the timeline breaks, the narrative breaks with it. And in the Summer Wells case, the most structurally disruptive fracture comes from a single event: a CPS visit on June 14, followed by Summer's disappearance on June 15. According to secondary material, Child Protective Services were at the Wells home the day before Summer vanished, an event not publicly acknowledged in the early stages of the investigation and absent from official press releases. This creates the shock of this section. A child disappears one day after governmental oversight increases. This timing is not merely unusual, it aligns with patterns observed in other cases where a child goes missing shortly before entering school or shortly before new welfare oversight begins. In such investigations, escalation events often trigger what analysts describe as reaction events. Actions taken by caregivers who fear imminent intervention, loss of custody, or exposure of long-standing household issues. These scenarios do not automatically indicate criminal intent, but they correlate with sudden spikes in risk, instability, and unpredictable behavior. The CPS visit was linked to an ongoing case involving the 3 boys, not Summer herself, but the presence of CPS at the home on June 14 indicates that the household environment, not an external offender, was under scrutiny. When a child disappears 24 hours later, investigators must consider whether the disappearance intersects with the oversight timeline. If a household is unstable, if parents expect consequences, or if they anticipate intervention, the risk of impulsive, reactive, or panic-driven behavior increases sharply. The broader pattern is particularly relevant. In multiple U.S. cases, a child has disappeared shortly before beginning kindergarten, at the precise moment when mandated reporters such as teachers would become involved. In these cases, the school year acts not as a chronological marker, but as a trigger point. It forces daily visibility, routine accountability, and regular evaluation by professionals who are legally obligated to report signs of neglect or harm. When a household fears that exposure, some caregivers respond with concealment, even extreme forms. This is not a conclusion about guilt. It is a behavioral pattern that investigators routinely analyze. In Summer's case, the connection between CPS involvement and the disappearance creates structural pressure on the timeline. The question becomes, was the disappearance random, the result of an opportunistic offender entering the property at the exact moment CPS scrutiny intensified, or was it a reaction event, a response to immediate perceived threat within the home, where the threat is not a physical danger, but the possibility of losing control of the narrative? Unusual behaviors from Dawn and Candace on June 15, described as inconsistent, contradictory, or emotional in ways that do not align cleanly with their public statements, are noted in the secondary material. These behavioral descriptors, while unverified outside that source, fit into an analytical framework of stress response. Inconsistent recall, shifts in tone, overemphasis on certain details, and avoidance of others. None of these behaviors prove wrongdoing, but in the context of a sudden disappearance following a CPS visit, they become part of a larger diagnostic puzzle. The timeline collapse also intersects with movement patterns on June 15. The file describes the scent trail going down the driveway, terminating abruptly at the road, a termination consistent with vehicular pickup rather than wandering. If law enforcement believes that Summer entered a vehicle, voluntarily or involuntarily, then the timeline must address who had motive, opportunity, and urgency to move her at that moment. The alignment of these factors with the CPS visit the day before demands close examination. The CPS visit also contextualizes other details. The source notes that Summer was the only child sleeping in the basement while the older children slept upstairs. It references prior environmental concerns and mentions that CPS had an active case involving the boys. In many investigations, when a child in a multi-child household disappears immediately after a welfare visit, investigators ask whether the disappearance removed a variable that would have produced negative scrutiny. If a child is showing signs of neglect, injury, behavioral concerns, or disclosure of events inside the home, the stakes of a CPS follow-up increase significantly. The source also indicates that Summer's upcoming school enrollment, approximately 6 weeks away, was a known timeline within the household. Again, this does not establish wrongdoing, but it aligns with documented cases in which children disappear shortly before entering environments populated by mandated reporters. Taken together, these elements create what forensic analysts describe as a pressure timeline. June 14, CPS arrives. Concerns noted. Follow-up anticipated. June 15, child disappears. 6 weeks later, school year to begin. 4.5 years later, FBI raids a property connected to individuals in both social and geographic proximity to the home. A pressure timeline does not prove causation, but it reshapes the investigative landscape. It forces a re-evaluation of opportunity, motive, and action. It also raises questions about the initial framing of the disappearance as an accident or abduction without internal involvement. In the broader context of the case, the CPS visit stands out precisely because it is not part of the public record. When such a significant event is absent from community perception for years, its sudden re-emergence destabilizes established narratives. It challenges the assumption that Summer was safe at home. It challenges the assumption that the disappearance occurred in an environment free from oversight concerns. It challenges the assumption that external offenders were the only viable suspects. This brings us to the primary investigative question of this section. If Summer was never in danger at home, why does her disappearance occur the day after a CPS visit? Investigators cannot ignore this timing because, in child welfare cases, disappearance after oversight is one of the strongest statistical indicators of concealment behavior. In other cases, concealment has taken different forms: moving a child to another location, transferring the child to another household, staging an accident, or constructing an abduction narrative. The specifics vary. The pattern does not. The timeline collapse also intersects with the later movement of the investigation toward Van Hill Road. If the disappearance was a reaction event triggered by CPS involvement, then the selection of a secondary location, particularly one connected by blood to someone present on Ben Hill Road, takes on new significance. The presence of Fred Hill in the earlier stages of the case, the proximity of the Hill family properties, and the eventual involvement of the FBI at a Hill-linked location form a triad of timeline, movement, and relational mapping. The forensic question becomes, was the movement on June 15 consistent with an opportunistic offender emerging from the woods, or was it consistent with a household under immediate pressure, responding to oversight with reactive relocation? At this stage, the evidence remains incomplete. But the collapse of the timeline, the compression of oversight, disappearance, and movement into a 24-hour window is impossible to ignore. It is a central investigative axis, one that reframes every other fact in the case, and until law enforcement resolves that axis, one question will continue to hold. What happened between June 14 and June 15 that shifted this household from scrutiny to crisis? But the timeline is only one piece. There's another clue, one that's been sitting in plain sight since the earliest hours of the search, a clue that, when examined closely, undermines every version of the accident theory. A clue that points not inward, but outward. Among all physical indicators in the Summer Wells case, the most revealing and the most strategically underplayed in the public narrative is the trajectory of the K9 scent trail. Trained search dogs followed Summer's scent down the steep hillside, across the yard, and directly onto the driveway, where the trail terminated abruptly at the road. This abrupt ending is not ambiguous. It is not open to interpretation. It is a forensic marker that aligns with a very specific type of missing child scenario: vehicular transfer. The shock here is simple but decisive. If a child walks into the woods, the scent goes into the woods. If a child is carried into the woods, the scent goes into the woods. But if a scent ends at a road surface, it means the child reached the road, voluntarily or involuntarily, and left the scene in a vehicle. This is not speculation. It is standard tracking science. Search dogs are fully capable of tracking human scent across a variety of terrains, including gravel, hard-packed clay, asphalt, and concrete. The misconception that canines lose scent on a road is not supported by operational reality. What interrupts a scent trail is not the road. It is removal from the environment. There are only 3 mechanisms that stop a scent abruptly on a road. The subject enters a vehicle. The subject is lifted off the ground and carried into a vehicle. or a strong, immediate environmental contamination masks the scent, rare and unlikely on a rural road. The driveway to road transition, in this case, aligns with the first mechanism. The dog did not continue past the road. It did not turn left or right. It did not veer toward the tree line. It ended where a vehicle would logically stop. From a forensic standpoint, that is the single most important physical clue of the early search. And yet, for years, this detail was softened, downplayed, buried beneath the narrative of a lost child wandering into the woods. Why was this detail softened in early messaging? The scent ending point was mentioned in passing during the first weeks of public communication, but was never emphasized by investigators, local media, or TBI spokesman Jeremy Finnegan during early briefings. The disappearance was still framed as potentially involving wandering or accidental injury in the woods, despite the fact that the scent trail contradicted that hypothesis. There are several potential explanations for this strategic understatement. Investigators did not want to alert a potential offender. If law enforcement believed, from early on, that Summer entered a vehicle, broadcasting that information could have triggered destruction of evidence, flight, or coordinated stories among involved individuals. The community was emotionally invested in a lost child narrative. Authorities sometimes withhold details that shift the case toward abduction because abduction triggers panic, overwhelm, and mass misinformation. Law enforcement may have been protecting a developing lead. If a transport vector was suspected early, particularly one involving individuals known to the family, public disclosure could have compromised tracking of that lead. Regardless of the reasoning, the de-emphasis of the trail termination shaped public perception for years, even though the underlying forensic implication never changed. In cases where a child disappears and the K9 trail ends at a roadway, investigators typically classify the disappearance as vehicle-assisted abduction, unless strong contradictory evidence exists. Patterns seen in comparable cases include K9 follows scent to the shoulder of a road, child entered vehicle. K9 behavior becomes agitated or circles at the pickup point, indicating loss of ground-level scent. Trail does not resume on the opposite side of the road, eliminating the likelihood that the child continued on foot. In the Summer Wells case, the scent trail displayed precisely these characteristics: direct movement downhill, uninterrupted to the driveway, and termination at the road with no continuation. This mirrors numerous confirmed vehicular abduction cases documented by NCMEC and regional sheriff's departments across the United States. The absence of a continued trail is not consistent with wandering. Wandering trails always continue, even faintly. Vehicular pickups do not. The driveway at 110 Ben Hill is a constrained, highly predictable point of movement. Anyone familiar with the property layout would know that the driveway funnels all outbound traffic to a single exit point. It is the only practical location for a vehicle to stop without entering steep terrain. It is not visible from many points within the holler. A person with prior knowledge of the home's routines would know that children frequently walked or played in this area. A vehicle stopping at the base of the driveway could remain unnoticed for several seconds, long enough for a rapid transfer. This transforms the driveway into something more than a topographical feature. It becomes a probable contact zone, where an abductor, acquaintance, or opportunistic individual could intercept a child with minimal risk of detection. The scent trail does not exist in isolation. It fits inside the pressure timeline established by the CPS visit the day before. When a disappearance occurs immediately after a welfare check, investigators examine not only who had access, but who had urgency. The movement of the scent from the yard to the driveway suggests that Summer left the inner property perimeter and moved toward the road. Whether this movement was voluntary, guided, or forced is unknown, but its alignment with the CPS visit raises investigative questions. Did someone fear additional CPS scrutiny? Did someone attempt to relocate the child to another household? Did an external individual, already aware of CPS involvement, exploit the situation? The scent trail provides the physical mapping for these questions. Once the scent ends at the road, the analysis shifts from where she went to who could have taken her. This is not a theoretical question. It is a logistic one. Who, on June 15, had proximity to the road, knowledge of the family's routine, familiarity with the driveway layout, and access to a vehicle matching the movement timeline? The roadway in front of the Wells home is not a high-traffic zone. Only individuals with reason to be in Beach Creek or with personal connections in the area would plausibly drive that stretch at the exact time the scent trail ends. When paired with the red truck sightings from the same time window, a vehicle later confirmed to have connections to individuals tied by blood to the Van Hill Road property, the scent trail becomes part of a larger directional structure. It suggests movement out of Ben Hill, not movement into the woods. The FBI's recent operation on 3500 Van Hill Road recontextualizes the K9 trail. If federal agents believed the investigation was still rooted in random wandering or woodland misadventure, a large-scale multi-agency raid 9.5 miles away would be irrational. The trail leading to a roadway and stopping supports the idea that a vehicle moved Summer from one location to another. The scent trail is, in effect, the first marker on a map that ends at Van Hill Road. Ultimately, the scent trail forces a single, unavoidable question: who had both the opportunity and the motive to be positioned on Ben Hill Road at the exact moment the trail ended? This question is not optional. It is not rhetorical. It is the question that should have anchored the entire investigation from the beginning. Someone was on that road. Someone stopped. Someone picked up a child whose scent ended exactly where a vehicle would have been. The K9 trail doesn't tell us who, but it tells us where. And it tells us the disappearance was not confined to Ben Hill Road. It began there, but it didn't end there. So, here's what we know. A scent trail that ends at a road. A CPS visit the day before the disappearance. A red truck, spotted at the critical moment. A family network present on Ben Hill Road. And 4.5 years later, a federal raid on a pig farm, tied by blood to someone who was there from day one. If every piece of physical evidence, the scent trail, the CPS timing, the red truck, the federal raid, points in the same direction, why has no agency publicly acknowledged that path? Why, after 4.5 years, does the investigation remain shrouded in silence when the evidence itself is screaming? If you want to stay updated on this case and others like it, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this story isn't over. Not by a long shot. Here's what doesn't make sense. If Summer Wells wandered into the woods and got lost, why did the FBI wait 4.5 years to search a pig farm 9 miles away? If this was an accident, why does every piece of evidence point to a vehicle, a family network, and a location that law enforcement refused to name until now? The answer is simple: because this was never about a lost child. This was about something far more deliberate. And the deeper you dig, the more the official story falls apart. Let's talk about the footprints. Barefoot footprints, leading away from the Wells property, not into the woods, not toward the creek, away, down the driveway, toward the road. These prints were documented early in the investigation, but like the scent trail, they were never emphasized in public briefings. Why? Because barefoot prints on gravel tell a story that doesn't fit the narrative of a child wandering off to play. A 5-year-old doesn't walk barefoot down a steep gravel driveway in the middle of summer heat unless she's following someone, unless she's being led, unless she's moving with purpose. And here's the thing about those prints. They weren't erratic. They weren't the scattered, aimless steps of a confused child. They were directional, consistent, moving in one clear path, down the hill, toward the road, toward the exact spot where the scent trail ended. Forensic analysts who study child abduction cases know that barefoot prints on rough terrain are significant for 2 reasons. First, they indicate the child was not prepared for travel. No shoes means no planning, no intention to leave. Second, they suggest the child was either coerced or guided by someone they trusted. A stranger abduction typically involves force, speed, and minimal ground contact. The child is grabbed, carried, moved quickly. But when a child walks willingly, even barefoot on painful terrain, it means they're following someone familiar, someone they know, someone they trust, someone who told them it was okay. So, who was Summer following? The prints don't answer that question, but they eliminate one possibility. She wasn't alone. The alignment of the barefoot prints with the scent trail creates a dual confirmation, 2 independent forensic indicators pointing to the same conclusion. Summer walked down that driveway. She reached the road, and then she was gone. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. The prints were found early, within the first 24 to 48 hours of the search. That means investigators knew, from the very beginning, that this wasn't a case of a child wandering into the woods. They knew she made it to the road, they knew someone picked her up. And yet, for 4.5 years, the public narrative remained focused on search and rescue operations in the surrounding wilderness. Why the misdirection? Why allow volunteers to comb through miles of forest when the physical evidence pointed in the opposite direction? There are only two explanations. Either law enforcement was protecting an active lead and didn't want to tip off a suspect, or they were protecting someone. And if they were protecting someone, the question becomes, who? The red truck provides a partial answer. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a red truck on Ben Hill Road around the time Summer disappeared. Not speeding, not fleeing, just there, present. At the exact moment, a 5-year-old scent trail ended at the road. In rural Tennessee, vehicles are noticed, especially unfamiliar ones, especially on roads where everyone knows everyone. So when a red truck appears at the critical moment, it's not background noise, it's a data point. And here's what makes this truck so significant. It wasn't just any vehicle. According to the file, the red truck had connections to individuals tied by blood to the Van Hill Road property, the same property the FBI would raid 4.5 years later, the same property owned by Paul Hill, whose nephew Fred lived on Ben Hill Road the day Summer vanished, the same property with a barn, debris fields, and acreage that goes all the way back into the mountain. This is not coincidence. This is convergence. The barefoot prints lead to the road, the scent trail ends at the road, a red truck is seen on the road, and that truck is connected to a family network that includes someone who lived on the same road as the Wells family, someone who had proximity, someone who had access, someone who had opportunity. But opportunity alone doesn't explain motive. So, let's go back to the CPS visit, the 14th of June 2021. Child Protective Services arrive at the Wells home. An ongoing case involving the 3 boys, concerns noted, follow-up anticipated. And then, less than 24 hours later, Summer is gone. If you're an investigator, this timeline is a red flag, not a small one. A massive, flashing, impossible to ignore red flag. Because in child welfare cases, disappearance after oversight is one of the strongest indicators of concealment behavior. It suggests panic. It suggests reaction. It suggests someone feared what would happen if CPS came back. And if someone feared a follow-up visit, the question becomes, what were they trying to hide? Was it neglect? Was it abuse? Was it something worse? The file notes that Summer was the only child sleeping in the basement while the older children slept upstairs. It references prior environmental concerns. It mentions that CPS had an active case involving the boys. In many investigations, when a child in a multi-child household disappears immediately after a welfare visit, investigators ask whether the disappearance removed a variable that would have produced negative scrutiny. If Summer was showing signs of neglect, injury, behavioral concerns, or disclosure of events inside the home, the stakes of a CPS follow-up would have been catastrophic for the adults in that household. And if those adults believed they were about to lose custody, about to face charges, about to be exposed, the pressure to act would have been immense. So here's the question. Was Summer's disappearance a reaction to that pressure? The behavioral inconsistencies noted in the file support this theory. Dawn and Candace, described as inconsistent, contradictory, or emotional in ways that do not align cleanly with their public statements. Inconsistent recall, shifts in tone, overemphasis on certain details, avoidance of others. These are classic stress responses, the kind of responses you see when someone is trying to manage a narrative, when someone is trying to control what people know. But stress responses don't prove guilt, they prove pressure. And pressure can come from many sources: fear of judgment, fear of losing children, fear of being blamed, or fear of being caught. The timeline collapse, the compression of oversight, disappearance, and movement into a 24-hour window creates what forensic analysts call a pressure cooker scenario. Everything happens at once. CPS visits. Child disappears. Scent trail ends. Red truck appears. And then, silence. For 4.5 years, law enforcement says nothing. No updates, no disclosures, no confirmation of any specific search targets. And then, Suddenly, federal agents descend on a pig farm tied to a family network present on Ben Hill Road the day Summer vanished. So what changed? What broke the silence? The file provides a clue. The FBI received a credible tip of evidentiary value, not a rumor, not speculation. A credible tip. That means someone talked, someone who knew something, someone who had access to information that could be verified, and whatever they said was strong enough to mobilize federal resources, coordinate a multi-agency operation, and break 4.5 years of investigative silence. So, who talked? And what did they say? The file doesn't answer these questions directly, but it provides context. The raid was fully completed before authorities disclosed it to the media. A tactical decision to prevent contamination of evidence. This suggests investigators feared someone might destroy, alter, or remove material if they knew the search was coming. That level of concern indicates one of two things. Either the evidence was fragile, easily destroyed, or the individuals connected to the property were considered a flight risk or a destruction risk. Pig farms are forensically complex environments. Biological material degrades rapidly. Soil disturbances are constant. Animal activity complicates scent detection. And yet, despite all these challenges, the FBI acted. That means the tip wasn't vague. It was specific. Specific enough to justify the manpower. Specific enough to justify the secrecy. Specific enough to justify the risk. And here's what makes this even more significant. The file notes that evidence found on the property may not necessarily indicate that Summer's remains are present. Instead, it may indicate that she was there, even briefly, even historically. That distinction is critical, because in forensic investigations, presence is enough. You don't need a body to prove a child was at a location. You need trace evidence, DNA, soil samples, object transfer, chemical residues. This is exactly what happened in the Michael Vaughan case. Remains were never found, but evidence confirmed presence. Suspects were named. Arrests were made. The absence of a body did not prevent justice. So if the FBI found evidence that Summer was on the Van Hill Road property, even briefly, it would reframe the entire investigation. It would confirm that she was moved. It would confirm that someone transported her from Ben Hill Road to a secondary location. And it would confirm that the individuals connected to that property had direct involvement. But here's the problem. 4.5 years is a long time. Long enough for evidence to degrade. Long enough for memories to fade. Long enough for people to get comfortable, to think they got away with it. And maybe that's exactly what the FBI was counting on. Because when people think they're safe, they make mistakes. They talk, they slip, they leave traces they didn't know existed. The scale of the operation suggests investigators were looking for something specific. 15 Hawkins County Sheriff's Office vehicles, FBI units, TBI units, specialized teams. This wasn't a fishing expedition. This was a targeted search based on verified intelligence. And when you combine that level of coordination with the familial connections, the red truck, the scent trail, and the CPS timeline, a pattern emerges. A pattern that points to a network, not a lone offender, not a random stranger, a network of individuals connected by blood, geography, and opportunity. Individuals who were present on Ben Hill Road the day Summer disappeared. Individuals who had access to vehicles matching witness descriptions. Individuals who owned property capable of concealing evidence for years. And here's the most chilling part. If this was a network, if multiple people were involved, then the silence makes sense. Because silence isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about protecting each other. It's about making sure no one breaks, no one talks, no one cracks under pressure. But silence only works if everyone holds the line. And after 4.5 years, someone didn't. Someone broke, someone talked, someone gave the FBI enough to act. And now, the question isn't whether Summer was on that property. The question is, what else is there? What else did they find? What else are they not telling us? Because if the FBI found evidence of presence, they found evidence of movement. And if they found evidence of movement, they found evidence of intent. The Barefoot prints, the scent trail, the red truck, the CPS visit, the family network, the federal raid. Every piece of this puzzle points in the same direction, away from the woods, away from the accident theory, away from the stranger abduction narrative, and towards something far more deliberate, something far more calculated, something that required planning, coordination, and concealment. So here's the question that should be keeping everyone awake at night. If Summer Wells didn't wander into the woods, if she was picked up by someone she knew, if she was moved to a secondary location tied to a family network present on Ben Hill Road, then who made the call? Who decided what would happen to her? And who has been protecting that decision for 4.5 years? The evidence doesn't lie, the scent trail doesn't lie, the barefoot prints don't lie, and the FBI doesn't mobilize federal resources for a case they think is cold. They act when they have something, when they know something, when they're ready to move. And after 4.5 years of silence, they moved. So what are they waiting for now? What are they building? And when will they finally tell the truth? Because the truth is already written in the evidence. It's written in the footprints leading down the driveway. It's written in the scent trail ending at the road. It's written in the red truck spotted at the critical moment. It's written in the CPS visit the day before. And it's written in the federal raid on a pig farm, tied by blood to someone who was there from the beginning. The only question left is whether law enforcement will finally say it out loud, whether they'll finally name the individuals they've been circling for years, whether they'll finally confirm what the evidence has been screaming since day one, that Summer Wells didn't disappear. She was taken, and the people who took her are still out there. If you're still watching, drop a comment and let me know what you think. Do you believe the FBI found something on that property? Do you think someone in the family network knows what happened? And do you think we'll ever get the truth? Because this case is far from over, and the deeper we go, the darker it gets. Here's the equation that doesn't add up. A child disappears, a scent trail ends at a road, a red truck is spotted, a family network is present. 4.5 years pass, and then federal agents raid a pig farm tied to that same network. If you solve for X, what do you get? Because right now, the only variable that makes this equation work is the one law enforcement refuses to name. But before we can solve for X, we need to understand what happened after the raid. Because the silence that followed the FBI operation on 3500 Van Hill Road is just as telling as the operation itself. No arrests, no public statements about findings, no confirmation of evidence recovered, just another layer of silence added to 4.5 years of silence, and in that silence, the questions multiply. Did they find something? The scale of the operation suggests they did. You don't mobilize 15 sheriff's office vehicles, FBI units, TBI units, and specialized teams for nothing. You don't execute a raid with that level of coordination unless you have a vetted evidentiary basis. The file makes this clear. The FBI received a credible tip of evidentiary value. That language is specific. It's deliberate. It means something tangible pointed them to that property. But if they found something, why the continued silence? Why no arrests? Why no public acknowledgement of what was recovered? There are several possibilities. The evidence requires extensive forensic testing. DNA analysis, soil sampling, and chemical residue testing can take months, even years. If the FBI found biological material on a pig farm after 4.5 years, confirming its origin would require meticulous lab work. The evidence confirms presence, but not remains. As the file notes, evidence may indicate that Summer was there, even briefly, even historically, without confirming that her remains are present. This creates a legal challenge. Presence alone may not be enough to secure a conviction without additional corroborating evidence. The investigation is building a case against multiple individuals. If this involves a network, not a lone offender, prosecutors may be waiting to gather enough evidence to charge everyone involved simultaneously. Premature disclosure could allow co-conspirators to flee, destroy evidence, or coordinate alibis. Someone is cooperating. If the credible tip came from someone within the network, that individual may be providing ongoing information in exchange for leniency. Law enforcement would protect that source by maintaining operational secrecy. Any of these scenarios would explain the continued silence, but they don't explain the emotional toll, because while investigators build their case, a family waits, a community waits, and a little girl remains missing. The human cost of this silence is immeasurable. Summer's biological father has been vocal about his frustration with the lack of updates. Online communities dedicated to the case have grown increasingly skeptical of official narratives, and the Wells family, regardless of their involvement or innocence, has been subjected to years of public scrutiny, speculation, and accusation. This is what happens when silence replaces transparency, when secrecy replaces communication, when the need to protect an investigation overrides the need to provide answers. But here's what we do know. The evidence collected in this case, the scent trail, the Barefoot prints, the red truck, the CPS timeline, the family network, the federal raid, forms a coherent investigative structure. Each piece supports the others. Each piece points in the same direction. And that direction is not toward the woods. It's not toward a random stranger. It's toward a network of individuals connected by blood, geography, and opportunity. The scent trail told investigators that Summer reached the road and entered a vehicle. The Barefoot prints confirmed she walked down the driveway willingly, likely following someone she knew. The red truck placed a vehicle connected to the Hill family network on Ben Hill Road at the critical moment. The CPS visit the day before established a pressure timeline, a motive for reactive behavior, and the federal raid on Van Hill Road confirmed that investigators believe Summer was moved to a secondary location tied to that same network. When you map these elements chronologically, a narrative emerges. June 14, CPS visits the Wells home. Concerns are noted. Follow-up is anticipated. June 15, Summer disappears. Her scent trail leads to the road and stops. Barefoot prints confirm she walked down the driveway. A red truck is spotted on Ben Hill Road. Late 2023, the FBI raids a pig farm owned by Paul Hill, whose nephew Fred lived on Ben Hill Road at the time of the disappearance. The property is connected to the red truck sightings. The raid is based on a credible tip of evidentiary value. This is not a random sequence of events. This is a chain of causation. Each event triggers the next. Each event creates the conditions for the next. And at the center of this chain is a 5-year-old girl who trusted the wrong person. The question is, who was that person? The file doesn't name suspects, but it provides relational mapping. Fred Hill lived on Ben Hill Road. Paul Hill owned the Van Hill Road property. The Hill family network had proximity, access, and vehicles matching witness descriptions. The CPS visit created urgency. The scent trail and Barefoot prints confirmed movement. The federal raid confirmed investigative focus. If you're an investigator, this is where you apply pressure. You interview everyone in the network. You compare timelines. You look for inconsistencies. You offer deals to the weakest link. You wait for someone to break, and after 4.5 years, someone did. Someone gave the FBI enough to act. The question is, will they give enough to prosecute? Because here's the hard truth. Evidence of presence is not the same as evidence of culpability. You can prove a child was at a location without proving who brought her there. You can prove a vehicle was on a road without proving who was driving. You can prove a family network had proximity without proving coordination. Prosecutors need more than proximity. They need intent. They need action. They need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's where this case sits right now. Suspended between evidence and proof, between suspicion and conviction, between knowing and proving. The FBI knows something. The TBI knows something. The Hawkins County Sheriff's Office knows something. But knowing is not enough. Not in a court of law. Not when a child's life is at stake. Not when justice demands certainty. So what happens next? There are 3 possible outcomes. Arrests are made. If the evidence is strong enough, if the forensic testing confirms what investigators suspect, if the cooperating witness provides corroborating testimony, arrests could come. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. The case goes cold again. If the evidence is insufficient, if the forensic testing is inconclusive, if the cooperating witness recants or lacks credibility, the case could return to the same silence that defined the first 4 years. The investigation continues indefinitely. This is the most likely scenario. The FBI continues to build its case. More interviews, more forensic analysis, more pressure on the network, waiting for the final piece that turns suspicion into proof. Regardless of the outcome, one thing is certain. This case has already changed the way missing child investigations are perceived in rural America. It has exposed the limitations of local law enforcement. It has highlighted the importance of federal involvement, and it has demonstrated the power of community pressure in forcing transparency. Because without the online communities, without the citizen investigators, without the relentless demand for answers, this case might have stayed buried. The FBI might never have acted, the Van Hill Road property might never have been searched, and Summer Wells might have been forgotten, but she hasn't been forgotten. Her face is still on missing person posters, her name is still spoken in true crime communities, her story is still being told. And as long as people keep asking questions, as long as people keep demanding answers, the pressure on law enforcement to solve this case will not diminish. It will only grow. So here's what you need to understand. This case is not about one missing child. It's about every missing child. It's about the systems that fail them. It's about the silence that protects offenders. It's about the networks that enable harm. And it's about the communities that refuse to let them be forgotten. Summer Wells deserves justice. She deserves truth. She deserves to be found. And until that happens, this story will not end. The barefoot prints leading down the driveway, the scent trail ending at the road, the red truck spotted at the critical moment, the CPS visit the day before, the family network present on Ben Hill Road, the federal raid on Van Hill Road. These are not isolated facts. They are pieces of a map that leads from Ben Hill Road to Van Hill Road, from a 5-year-old's home to a 27-acre pig farm, from a moment of trust to a moment of betrayal. And somewhere along that map, someone knows exactly what happened. Someone knows where Summer is. Someone knows who took her. Someone knows why. The question is, will they ever tell? Or will the silence continue? Will the investigation drag on for another 4 years? Will the evidence remain just out of reach? Will the network hold? Or will someone finally break? Because here's the thing about silence. It's not permanent. It's fragile. It requires constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant fear. And fear is exhausting. Fear makes people sloppy. Fear makes people talk. Fear makes people confess. And after 4.5 years, someone is afraid. Someone is losing sleep. Someone is wondering if today is the day the FBI comes back. If today is the day the evidence is confirmed. If today is the day the truth comes out. And maybe that's the real power of cases like this. Not the evidence, not the forensics, not the federal raids, but the pressure, the relentless, unending pressure of knowing that people are watching, people are asking questions, people are not letting this go. Because in the end, justice is not just about what law enforcement does. It's about what communities demand. It's about what we refuse to accept. It's about what we will not let be buried. Summer Wells was 5 years old. She loved her family. She trusted the people around her. She walked down a driveway barefoot, following someone she knew, and she never came home. That is the only fact that matters. Everything else, the investigations, the raids, the silence, the speculation, is just noise. The only thing that matters is finding her, bringing her home, and holding accountable the people who took her. So if you've watched this far, I need you to do something. I need you to share this video. I need you to comment below with your thoughts. Do you think the FBI found evidence on that property? Do you think arrests are coming? Do you think we'll ever know the truth? Because your engagement matters. Your voice matters. Your refusal to let this case fade into obscurity matters. And if you know something, if you were in Beach Creek on the 15th of June 2021, if you saw a red truck, if you heard something, if you know someone in the Hill family network who's been acting strange, contact the FBI, contact the TBI, contact the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office, because tips matter, witnesses matter, and one piece of information, one detail you think is insignificant, could be the piece that solves this case. Summer Wells is still missing, but she is not forgotten. And as long as people like you keep watching, keep asking questions, keep demanding answers, there is hope. Hope that the silence will break. Hope that the truth will emerge. Hope that justice will be served. So don't just watch this video and move on. Engage, share, comment, demand answers. Because that's how cases get solved. That's how pressure builds. That's how silence breaks. And if you want to stay updated on this case and others like it, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell. Because when there's a break in this case, when arrests are made, when the truth finally comes out, you'll be the first to know. This is not over, not by a long shot. And we will keep telling Summer's story until she is found, until justice is served, until the people responsible are held accountable. The equation is still unsolved. But every day, we get closer to the answer. Every day, the pressure builds. Every day, someone in that network gets a little more afraid. And one day, that fear will break them. One day, the truth will come out. One day, Summer Wells will get the justice she deserves. Until then, we keep asking. We keep demanding. We keep fighting. Because that's what we do for children who can't fight for themselves. That's what we do for families who deserve answers. That's what we do for justice. So tell me, what do you think happened to Summer Wells? Drop your theory in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going. Let's keep the pressure on. Let's make sure this case never goes cold again. Because Summer is counting on us, and we will not let her down.